The earth beneath Clara Whitfield's home was moving, breathing alive with something that should not exist. What started as a simple ant mound in her Louisiana garden became a nightmare that would consume everything she loved. Scientists would later call it impossible, a phenomenon that defied nature's laws. But Clara knew the truth: some horrors don't wait to be discovered, they rise. If you're watching from New Orleans, Baton Rouge, or anywhere across this beautiful haunted state, stay with me. Comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. Clara Whitfield had always believed in the healing power of Earth. For 15 years, she'd returned from 12-hour shifts at Mercy General Hospital to sink her hands into the rich Louisiana soil, finding peace in the simple act of cultivation. Her garden wasn't just a hobby, it was her sanctuary, her therapy, her connection to something pure in a world that showed her too much suffering. The evening it all began was unremarkable in every way except one. October had painted the sky in shades of copper and rust, and Clara knelt among her tomato plants, their leaves still heavy with the day's humidity. She was 43 years old, her dark hair streaked with premature silver from years of emergency room stress. Her hands steady despite everything they'd seen. Those hands had saved lives, had held the dying, had sutured wounds that would have killed lesser souls. But in her garden, they only created beauty. "Just you and me tonight, Duke," she murmured to her 12-year-old German shepherd, who lay stretched across the porch steps, his graying muzzle resting on crossed paws. Duke had been her constant companion since her divorce 8 years ago, when Marcus had decided that her dedication to both her patients and her garden left too little room for him. She'd chosen to let him go rather than sacrifice the two things that gave her life meaning. The first sign of wrongness was so subtle she almost missed it. Near the weathered wooden fence that separated her property from the Hendersons' next door, a small mound of earth had appeared. It was perhaps 6 inches high, perfectly conical, with an opening at the top no wider than her thumb. Clara studied it with the clinical eye of someone trained to notice details that others might overlook. "Fire ants," she said aloud, though something about the mound troubled her. The soil was different, darker, almost black despite the red clay that dominated this part of Louisiana. And the structure itself was too perfect, too deliberately crafted. Fire ant mounds were usually irregular, chaotic things. This looked almost architectural. Duke lifted his head, his amber eyes focusing on the mound with an intensity that made Clara's skin prickle. A low growl rumbled in his chest, so quiet she felt it more than heard it. "It's just ants, boy," she said, but her voice carried less certainty than she'd intended. She reached for her garden spade, intending to level the mound before it could establish itself. But as her hand drew near, Duke barked sharp warning, urgent. Clara jerked back, startled. Duke never barked at her, not even in play. He was on his feet now, hackles raised, positioning himself between her and the mound. "What's gotten into you?" She stood brushing dirt from her knees. The sun was setting faster now, shadows lengthening across her garden like dark fingers. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the past few minutes, unusual even for October. She decided to leave the mound for tomorrow. After all, what harm could ants do overnight? That night, Clara dreamed of tunnels. Miles and miles of tunnels, branching and interconnecting in patterns that hurt to contemplate. She was running through them, her bare feet slapping against smooth, worn earth, something massive pursuing her through the darkness. She could hear it breathing. No, not breathing. Clicking. Thousands of tiny clicks like fingernails on glass growing closer with each heartbeat. She woke at 3:17 a.m., her sheets soaked with sweat. Duke whimpering at her bedside. His eyes were fixed on the window that overlooked the garden. Clara rose, her nurse's instinct overriding her desire to dismiss the dream as nonsense. She padded to the window and pulled back the curtain. The mound was glowing. Not brightly, not obviously, but there was definitely a faint phosphorescence emanating from within. It pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat made of light. "That's not possible," Clara whispered. Duke pressed against her leg, trembling. She grabbed her phone, intending to search for bioluminescent ants. Surely there was a scientific explanation. But her internet was down. The power was still on. Her bedside clock glowed its usual red. But her router was dead and her phone showed no signal. The rational part of her brain, the part trained in medical school to think logically under pressure, offered explanations. Power surge. Coincidence. stressed mind creating connections where none existed. But the primitive part, the part that had kept humanity alive for millennia by recognizing danger, screamed at her to run. She didn't run. She was Clara Whitfield, and she didn't run from anything. The next morning, she called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Dr. Patterson was surprised, but didn't question it. Clara had accumulated enough goodwill to take a dozen sick days without anyone batting an eye. The mound had grown. It now stood a full foot high, and the opening at the top had widened to the size of a softball. The phosphorescence was gone in the daylight, but the unsettling perfection of its construction remained. Clara crouched beside it, careful not to get too close after Duke's reaction the night before. "Okay," she said to herself. "Let's think about this logically." She retrieved her rarely used laptop from the house and set it up on the porch, finally getting a weak internet signal. Her search for unusual ant mounds, Louisiana, yielded the typical results about fire ants and carpenter ants. Nothing about perfect cones, nothing about phosphorescence, nothing about mounds that doubled in size overnight. She was about to give up when she found a forum post from 3 years ago. A user named Deep Bayou 225 had posted a series of increasingly frantic messages about similar mounds appearing in his yard near Lafayette. The post stopped abruptly after 2 weeks. The final message simply read, "They're not ants." Clara tried to contact Deep Bayou 225, but the account had been inactive since that last post. She spent the rest of the morning watching the mound, documenting it with her phone camera, despite the strange static that appeared in every image. By noon, she'd noticed something else: no insects went near it. Her garden was usually alive with bees, butterflies, and yes, regular ants. But there was a clear circle, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, that every creature avoided. Every creature except one. Mrs. Henderson's cat Gumbo was a fat orange tabby who treated property lines as suggestions. Clara watched him saunter into her yard, heading straight for the mound with typical feline curiosity. "No, Gumbo, don't." The cat stopped exactly at the edge of the dead zone, his tail puffing up to 3 times its normal size. He hissed, backed away, then ran something Clara had never seen the lazy cat do, back to his own yard. That afternoon, she called Tom Brennan, her cousin, who worked for the Louisiana Department of Agriculture. He listened to her description with increasing skepticism. "Clara, honey, you're describing fire ants. They make mounds. Their aggressive pets don't like them. Nothing unusual about that." "Tom, I'm telling you, this is different. The structure is too perfect. It's growing too fast. And last night..." "Last night what?" She hesitated. How could she tell her pragmatic cousin about the glowing without sounding insane? "Just... can you come look at it?" "Please." He sighed. "I can stop by Thursday. That's the earliest I can manage." Thursday was 3 days away. Clara agreed, though every instinct told her 3 days might be too long. That evening, she sat on her porch with a glass of wine, Duke at her feet, watching the sunset behind the mound. It cast a longer shadow, now reaching almost to her tomato plants. She'd measured it before dinner, 18 inches high, the opening now wide enough to fit her fist, though she had no intention of trying. "We should leave," she said to Duke. "Pack up and stay with Mom for a few days." Duke looked at her with those wise amber eyes, and she could almost hear his response. "You've never run from anything in your life. Why start now?" She was still sitting there when the vibrations started. At first she thought it was a truck passing on the road, but the tremor didn't fade. It maintained a steady rhythm, like a massive heartbeat deep underground. Her wine glass began to walk across the porch table, and Duke stood growling at something beneath the earth. Clara placed her palm flat on the porch boards. The vibration was definitely coming from below, and it was definitely centered on the mound. She grabbed her flashlight, though dusk still provided enough light to see. Approaching the mound, she noticed new details. The opening wasn't just a hole, it had structure-reinforced walls that gleamed with some kind of secretion. And deep within, so deep she couldn't see the bottom, something moved. Not scurrying like ants, flowing like liquid given purpose. Clara backed away, her heart hammering. Whatever was in that mound, whatever was building it, wasn't following any natural pattern she knew, and it was getting stronger. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her bedroom chair, Duke alert beside her, watching the mound through her window. At 2 a.m., the phosphorescence returned brighter this time. At 3 a.m., she saw shapes emerging from the opening. Not ants, not exactly, but something that moved with terrible coordination spreading across her garden in perfect formation before retreating back into the earth. At 4 a.m., she noticed new mounds beginning to form, 3 of them arranged in a triangle around the original. At 5 a.m., she called Tom again, leaving a voicemail that she knew sounded desperate. "Don't wait until Thursday. Come now, please." At 6 a.m., as the first light of dawn painted the sky, she saw something that made her question her sanity. The original mound had grown again now, 3 feet high, and its surface was moving, undulating, as if the earth itself was breathing. She made coffee with shaking hands, trying to impose normalcy on a situation that had left normal far behind. The local news droned in the background, the anchor discussing a water main break in Baton Rouge, the Saints' chances. This season, the weather forecast calling for thunderstorms later in the week. Nothing about unusual geological activity. Nothing about strange phenomena. Nothing about the fact that Clara Whitfield's garden was being colonized by something that shouldn't exist. She called the hospital extending her sick leave. Dr. Patterson was concerned now Clara never took 2 days in a row, but she assured him it was just a stomach bug. "Must be something going around," he said. Martinez and Chen both called in sick today, too. A chill ran down Clara's spine. Martinez lived 3 blocks away. Chen lived 5. "Did they say what was wrong?" "Same as you stomach thing. Get some rest, Clara. We need you back healthy." She hung up and immediately looked up her colleague's social media. Martinez had posted yesterday about finding weird ant hills in his backyard. Chen's last post from 2 days ago showed a photo of his kids playing in their yard. In the background, barely visible, was a small mound by their swing set. Clara's hands trembled as she dialed Tom again. This time he answered. "Clara, I got your message. It's not just me, it's spreading. My colleagues have them too. Tom, you need to contact someone. The CDC, the EPA, someone." "Slow down. What exactly are we talking about?" She took a breath, forcing herself to speak clearly, clinically. "Unknown organisms creating rapid structural formations, bioluminescent properties, apparent collective intelligence, spreading through multiple residential areas. Tom, this could be an invasive species we've never seen before." There was a long pause. "I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't do anything until I arrive." "What if—" "Clara, 2 hours. Stay inside." She wanted to argue, but Tom had already hung up. She looked out at her garden where the 4 mounds now stood like monuments to her failure to act sooner. The original had to be 4 feet high now, its opening wide enough for her to crawl through if she were insane enough to try. Duke hadn't left her side all morning, pressing against her legs as if to keep her from going outside. She stroked his gray muzzle, finding comfort in his loyalty. "We should have left," she told him. "When you first warned me, we should have left." But even as she said it, she knew it wouldn't have mattered. Whatever was happening here was bigger than her garden, bigger than her neighborhood. The pattern was spreading, and leaving would only have delayed the inevitable confrontation. She made herself breakfast toast. She couldn't eat coffee that went cold in her hands, and waited. Through the window, she watched the mounds shimmer in the morning sun, their surfaces now covered in what looked like a thin film of glass. Beautiful in a terrible way. Like cancer cells under a microscope, deadly, but possessing an undeniable organic elegance. At 8:47 a.m., exactly 2 hours after Tom's call, she heard vehicles approaching. Not just Tom's truck, but multiple vehicles. She went to the front door to see a convoy pulling up Tom's Department of Agriculture truck, 2 Louisiana State Police cars, and a white van with no markings. Tom got out first, his face grim. He was followed by 2 state troopers and 3 people in what looked like hazmat suits without the helmets. "Clara," Tom said, "these folks are from the CDC. Seems your call wasn't the first they've gotten." A woman in one of the suits stepped forward. "Dr. Whitfield, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to your colleague. We need to see the formations." Clara led them around the house to the back garden. When they rounded the corner, everyone stopped. The mounds had changed again. The 4 structures were now connected by raised ridges in the earth, forming a perfect diamond. The ridges pulsed with that same phosphorescence she'd seen at night, visible even in daylight. And the sound she hadn't noticed when it started, but there was definitely a sound now. A low hum, almost below the range of human hearing, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Jesus Christ," Tom muttered. Dr. Chen was already directing her team, who began setting up equipment Clara didn't recognize. One device looked like ground-penetrating radar. Another seemed to be taking air samples. The third team member was photographing everything with a camera that looked far more sophisticated than anything civilian. Dr. Whitfield, Chen said, not looking away from the mounds. When did you first notice the formation? 2 days ago, Tuesday evening. And the growth rate? Exponential. The first mound has gone from 6 inches to 4 feet in less than 48 hours. Any direct contact? No, my dog warned me away from the beginning. Chen looked at Duke with interest. Animals often sense things we miss. Has anyone else in the neighborhood reported pet reactions? Mrs. Henderson's cat ran from it, and Clara remembered something. There are no insects. Nothing will go near them. Except whatever's inside, Chen said quietly. You know what this is. We have theories. Similar formations have been reported in 12 locations across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. Yours is the most advanced we've seen. What do you mean, advanced? Chen turned to her, and Clara could see fear in the woman's eyes, despite her professional composure. The others are just individual mounds. Yours is showing network behavior. It's organizing. As if in response to her words, the hum intensified. The ridges connecting the mounds began to rise higher, and Clara watched in horror as new openings appeared along their length. Not random holes evenly spaced, perfectly circular, all the same size. We need to evacuate the neighborhood, one of the state troopers said. Not yet, Chen replied. If we cause panic, people will flee in all directions, potentially spreading whatever this is. We need containment first. Containment of what? Clara demanded. What's down there? Chen hesitated, then seemed to decide Clara deserved the truth. We don't know, but preliminary ground scans at other sites suggest extensive tunnel systems. Whatever's creating these mounds isn't just living in them. They're excavating, building. Building what? That's what we're trying to figure out before. She was cut off by a sound Clara would never forget. It started as a whisper like wind through leaves, then grew to a roar, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. The ground beneath their feet began to crack spiderwebbing out from the diamond formation. Everyone back, Chen shouted. Move now! They ran for the house as the garden erupted. The earth split open, revealing darkness beneath, and from that darkness came a living river of something that defied immediate classification. They weren't ants. They were too large, too coordinated, too wrong. Each was the size of Clara's thumb, with bodies that seemed to shift between solid and liquid, and they moved with a synchronization that spoke of a single controlling intelligence. Clara grabbed Duke's collar, pulling him with her as they fled. Behind them, she could hear the things, whatever they were, spreading across her garden with purposeful efficiency. Not destroying, but transforming, claiming. They made it to the house, slamming the door behind them. Through the window, Clara watched her sanctuary disappear beneath a writhing mass of organisms that built as they consumed, raising new structures from the bones of her plants. Calling for backup, one of the troopers said into his radio, We need everyone. Everything. This is not a drill. Dr. Chen was on her satellite phone speaking rapidly to someone. Confirmed emergence at the Whitfield site, Pattern 7 manifestation. Requesting immediate containment protocols. Pattern 7, Clara asked. Chen looked at her with something like sympathy. It means we've moved beyond observation. Whatever they are, they're done hiding. Outside, the sky began to darken with approaching storm clouds, as if nature itself was responding to the violation occurring in Clara's garden. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. But the things building their city in her backyard didn't seem to care about the weather. They continued their work with mechanical precision, and Clara realized with sinking certainty that this was only the beginning. Her sanctuary hadn't been destroyed, it had been chosen, and what was rising from beneath it would change everything. The vibrations she'd felt weren't random. They were calling, and now something had answered. Duke pressed against her legs, whimpering, and Clara knew exactly how he felt. They were witnesses to something unprecedented, something that challenged every assumption about the natural world, and they were powerless to stop it. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder. Clara, I'm sorry, my garden is gone, she said quietly. The question now is whether we can save everything else. Dr. Chen ended her call and turned to face them. The National Guard is mobilizing. We have 6 hours before they arrive. Until then, we need to document everything we can. Document? Clara laughed bitterly. My home is being invaded by something that shouldn't exist, and you want to document it. Yes, Chen said simply, because this is happening in 12 other locations simultaneously. Whatever triggered this, whatever these things are, they're not random. This is coordinated, planned, and if we don't understand it, we can't stop it. Clara looked back at her garden, where impossible structures were rising from the earth, where her 15 years of careful cultivation were being erased and replaced with something alien. The nurse in her, the part that always fought to save lives, understood Chen's position. But the human in her, the woman who had found peace in that soil, wanted to scream. What do you need from me? She asked instead. Everything, every detail, every observation, every instinct. You've been watching this from the beginning. You might have seen something we've missed. Clara nodded, forcing herself to think clinically. She began to recount everything from Duke's first warning growl to the phosphorescent glow to the spreading pattern among her colleagues. Chen recorded it all, occasionally asking for clarification. Outside, the transformation continued. The 4 mounds were no longer separate structures, but part of something larger, something that was revealing itself one impossible piece at a time. The storm was moving closer, and Clara wondered what would happen when the rain hit those things, whatever they were. She was about to find out. The first drops began to fall at 10:23 a.m., and the reaction was immediate. The creatures, she couldn't think of them as ants anymore, began to move faster, their construction taking on a frantic quality. Steam rose from their bodies where the rain touched them, and they began to secrete something that hardened instantly into a protective shell over their structures. They're adapting, Chen breathed. Real-time evolution. That's not possible. But possible or not, it was happening. The rain intensified, and the creatures responded by building faster, higher, creating covers and channels that directed the water away from their central structures. In minutes, they had engineered a drainage system that would have taken human builders days to design. Pattern 7, Clara said, understanding beginning to dawn. You've seen this before. Not here, but somewhere. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, Antarctica. 3 years ago. A research station found something in the ice. We thought we contained it. Thought. The site was sterilized, nuclear protocols. But if these are the same organisms, if they survived… Chen trailed off, the implications clear. Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Not metaphorically, the actual floor was moving. Cracks appeared in the walls, small at first, then widening. They're underneath us, Tom said, his voice tight with controlled panic. They've been digging while we watched the surface. The house groaned, and Clara heard the sound of splintering wood from somewhere below. Duke barked, pulling toward the front door, and Clara trusted his instincts. Everyone out, she shouted. Now! They ran bursting through the front door just as the back of the house began to collapse. Clara turned to see her home, her refuge for 15 years, fold in on itself as the ground beneath it gave way. The creatures poured up through the wreckage, not attacking, not yet, but claiming, building. In the street, neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the sound. They stood in the rain, watching in stunned silence as Clara's property was transformed into something unrecognizable. Set up a perimeter, Chen ordered the state troopers. No one gets close. But even as they moved to comply, Clara could see it was too late. Mrs. Henderson was pointing at her own backyard where a familiar mound was rising. Across the street, the Johnsons' lawn was beginning to buckle. It wasn't an invasion. It was an emergence. And it was happening everywhere at once. The rain continued to fall, and the creatures continued to build, and Clara stood in the street with Duke at her side, watching the world she knew disappear one garden at a time. The childhood lullabies were wrong. It wasn't London Bridge that was falling down. It was everything. And from beneath, something new was rising to take its place. The rain had stopped, but the damage was spreading like ink through water. Clara stood in the middle of Magnolia Street, her clothes still damp, watching emergency vehicles arrive from every direction. It had been 3 hours since her house collapsed, 3 hours since the world she knew had started unraveling, and now the entire neighborhood was transforming into something unrecognizable. We need to move you to a safe zone, Dr. Chen said, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew there was no safe zone, not anymore. The creatures Clara had started thinking of them as the builders were emerging from sites all across the parish. Police scanners crackled with reports of collapses of strange formations of impossible things rising from familiar ground. I'm not leaving, Clara said firmly. I'm a nurse. People are going to get hurt and they'll need medical attention. Chen studied her for a moment, then nodded. Stay close to the command post then. We're setting up at the community center. The community center was only 3 blocks away, but the journey felt like crossing into another world. Every lawn showed signs of disturbance, small mounds beginning to form cracks spreading across driveways, pets cowering on porches, while their owners stood in confused clusters pointing and whispering. Clara recognized the pattern now. The builders weren't random. They were methodical, systematic, following some blueprint that humans couldn't yet comprehend. Duke stayed pressed against her leg, occasionally growling at movements beneath the asphalt that only he could sense. Clara had given up trying to comfort him. The dog understood something fundamental, that the humans were still struggling to accept their world had been invaded from below, and the invasion was already won. At the community center, chaos was being forcibly organized into something resembling a response. The National Guard had arrived faster than expected, setting up barriers and equipment with practiced efficiency. Scientists from various agencies huddled over laptops and ground-penetrating radar displays. Someone had brought in a coffee machine, and the mundane smell of brewing coffee contrasted surreally with the extraordinary crisis unfolding around them. Dr. Whitfield, a voice called. Clara turned to see Martinez, her colleague from the hospital. His face was pale, his usually immaculate scrubs replaced with mud-stained jeans and a LSU sweatshirt. Thank God you're okay. Have you seen Dr. Chen from the hospital? Not the CDC one? He was at home last I heard, Claire replied. His kids. They're safe. Evacuated to the hospital. But his house… Martinez shook his head. It's gone. Just like yours. The whole east side of Willow Court is gone. Clara felt the weight of that statement settle on her shoulders. Willow Court was 6 blocks from her house. The affected area was growing exponentially, just like the mounds themselves. We need to set up a medical station, she said, falling back on her training. People are going to panic, and panic means injuries. Martinez nodded, grateful for something concrete to do. They commandeered a corner of the community center using folding tables and whatever supplies the guard could spare. It wasn't much, but it was something. Within an hour, they were treating their first patient, a child who'd cut his foot on broken glass while fleeing his house, an elderly woman having a panic attack, a man who'd tried to fight the builders with a shovel and had mysteriously lost all feeling in his hands. That last case worried Clara the most. The man, Robert Thibodeau, was a contractor who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. His hands showed no visible injury, but he couldn't feel anything from the wrists down. It was like touching static electricity, he said, his Cajun accent thick with fear. But cold static, if that makes sense. Then nothing. Can't feel nothing at all. Claire performed every neurological test she knew, but the results were baffling. The nerves seemed intact. Blood flow was normal, but the sensory connection was simply gone. She documented everything, knowing that this information might be crucial later. As she worked, she listened to the reports coming in over various radios and phones. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Similar emergencies were confirmed in Baton Rouge, Lafayette, Lake Charles, and as far east as Mobile. The government was mobilizing resources on a scale not seen since Hurricane Katrina, but this wasn't a natural disaster they knew how to fight. Clara Tom appeared at her makeshift medical station, his face grim. Chen wants you, says you need to see something. She left Martinez in charge and followed Tom to where Dr. Chen was standing with a group of scientists around a large monitor. On the screen was a composite image created from multiple ground-penetrating radar scans. This is what's beneath us, Chen said without preamble. Every red line is a tunnel. Every node is a chamber. Clara stared at the image, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The tunnel system was vast, complex beyond imagination. It looked like a 3-dimensional spider web, or maybe a neural network spreading for miles in every direction. Her house, or where her house had been, sat at one of the major nodes. How deep? She asked. The deepest tunnels we can detect are 300 feet down, but our equipment has limits. They could go deeper. How long would it take to dig all this? Chen exchanged glances with her colleagues. That's the thing. According to soil displacement analysis, these tunnels were dug in the last 72 hours. That's impossible. So is everything else about this situation. Chen pulled up another image, this one showing a time lapse of the tunnel formation. Watch this. This is data from the last 3 days compressed into 30 seconds. Clara watched the screen as tunnels spread like veins, like roots, like thoughts through a vast brain. The pattern was hypnotic, almost beautiful, and utterly terrifying. It showed intelligence, purpose, and a construction capability that surpassed human technology by orders of magnitude. They're not just digging randomly, Chen continued. They're following geological formations, avoiding utility lines, working around obstacles. They know what they're doing. But what are they doing? Clara asked. What's the purpose? Before Chen could answer, the lights flickered. Everyone froze. The emergency generator kicked in a second later, but the message was clear. The builders had reached the power infrastructure. Everyone remained calm, someone from the National Guard announced, but Clara could hear the tension in his voice. Through the windows, she could see that the entire neighborhood had lost power. But there was light. That phosphorescent glow she'd first seen in her garden was now emanating from dozens of points across the landscape. The builders didn't need human electricity. They had their own. We need to evacuate, someone said. Pull everyone back to a safe distance and reassess. There is no safe distance, Chen replied. The tunnel system extends for at least 10 miles in every direction. We'd have to evacuate half of Louisiana. As if to emphasize her point, a new sound began, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Clara felt it in her bones, in her teeth, in the beat of her heart. Duke howled a sound she'd never heard him make before, and every other dog in the area joined in, creating a chorus of primal fear. They're synchronized, one of the scientists said, staring at his instruments. Every emergent site is pulsing at exactly the same frequency. How is that possible without communication? Maybe they are communicating, Clara said, remembering the collective movement she'd witnessed in her garden. Just not in a way we understand. The thumping intensified, and cracks began appearing in the community center's walls. Not structural failure, these were too straight, too deliberate. The builders were creating entry points. Defensive positions, the guard commander ordered, and soldiers moved to block the emerging cracks. No, Chen said sharply. No aggressive action. We don't know how they'll respond to violence. Then what do you suggest we do? The commander demanded. Before Chen could answer, the cracks widened and the builders flowed through. But they didn't attack. They moved past the humans as if they weren't there, spreading across the floor in perfect formations, their bodies creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Clara noticed that they avoided Duke and the other animals, maintaining a careful distance from anything living. They're mapping, she realized. They're mapping us. The builders moved with liquid precision, covering every surface, every corner before retreating back through the cracks they'd created. The whole process took less than 2 minutes, and then they were gone, leaving only the faint smell of ozone and earth. What just happened? Martinez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. First contact, Chen replied. They've acknowledged we're here. The implications of that statement hung in the air. These weren't mindless insects. They were something with awareness, with purpose, with the ability to recognize other forms of life. The question was, what did they intend to do with that recognition? Clara's phone buzzed. Somehow it had signal again. The screen showed a message from an unknown number, look outside. She wasn't the only one who'd received it. All around the room, phones were lighting up with the same message. They moved to the windows as one, and what they saw defied every natural law Clara knew. The builders had created something in the parking lot. Not a mound, not a tunnel entrance, but a structure that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. It twisted and folded in ways that made Clara's eyes water to follow, and at its center was something that looked almost like a screen showing images that shifted too fast to fully comprehend. They're trying to communicate, Chen breathed. Or they're warning us, Tom said darkly. The images on the impossible screen began to slow resolving into something recognizable. It showed the Earth, but not as any satellite had ever captured it. This was Earth from below. From the perspective of something that lived in the deep places and the spaces between stones and the darkness that had existed before humans ever walked the surface. And in that darkness, continents of tunnels spread like neural pathways through a vast brain. The builders weren't invading. They were revealing something that had always been there waiting. "My God," someone whispered. "How long have they been down there?" The screen changed, showing what looked like a timeline, but the scale was incomprehensible. If Claire was reading it right, the builders predated human civilization by millions of years. They had been here first, and they had been waiting. But waiting for what? The screen flickered and showed a new image, the sun, but wrong somehow. Darker, angrier, with coronas of energy that looked diseased. Then it showed the earth again, the surface this time scorched and lifeless. The image pulled back to show the underground network still thriving, still building, preserving something in the deep darkness. "They're not invading," Clara said, understanding hitting her like a physical blow. "They're preparing. They're building shelters." "Shelters from what?" Martinez asked. The screen answered him, showing a date. Not in any human calendar, but somehow Clara understood it anyway. 3 years. They had 3 years before whatever the builders were preparing for arrived. The structure in the parking lot began to dissolve, the screen folding in on itself until nothing remained but scorched asphalt and the lingering smell of ozone. Around them, phones began buzzing with new messages, all from unknown numbers, all containing the same thing: coordinates. "They're telling us where to go," Chen said, studying the numbers. "These locations, they're all deep underground. They're inviting us into the tunnels." "It's a trap," the guard commander said immediately. "Or it's an offer of sanctuary," Clara countered. She thought of the careful way the builders had avoided harming anyone, how they'd mapped, but not attacked, how they'd tried to communicate rather than simply overwhelm. What if they're not our enemy? What if they're trying to save us? The debate that followed was heated, but Clara barely heard it. She was thinking about the image of the scorched earth, about the 3-year timeline, about the way Duke had known from the beginning that something was wrong but hadn't tried to attack the mounds, only to warn her away. Her phone buzzed again. This message was different, personal. "Clara Whitfield, your garden was chosen for its life. Your care was recognized. The deep places remember kindness." She showed the message to Chen, who stared at it with a mixture of fascination and fear. "They know who you are. They've been watching." For how long? Clara wondered aloud. The answer came in another message, always. Outside, the phosphorescent glow was spreading, turning the neighborhood into something from another world. The builders were no longer hiding. They moved openly now, constructing things that human eyes couldn't properly perceive, preparing for something that Clara was beginning to understand might be worse than invasion. "We need to make a choice," Chen said to the room at large. "Do we fight them, or do we try to understand them?" "Why not both?" Clara suggested. "Set up communication protocols, but maintain defensive positions. They've shown they can be patient. Maybe we should learn to be the same." The guard commander looked like he wanted to argue, but his radio crackled with new orders from higher up. The expression on his face, as he listened, told Clara everything she needed to know. The decision had been made at levels far above their pay grade. "We're to observe and document," he said, clearly unhappy with the orders. "No aggressive action unless directly threatened. Scientists are being flown in from around the world. They want to understand what we're dealing with before we do anything irreversible." It was a reasonable decision, but Clara wondered if they had the luxury of time. The 3-year deadline the builders had shown them suggested otherwise. As night began to fall, the transformed neighborhood took on an even more surreal quality. The phosphorescent glow created shadows that moved independently of their sources, and the sound of construction never ceased. The builders worked tirelessly, their structures growing more complex by the hour. Clara found herself at the window, Duke by her side, watching her former home. Where her garden had been something magnificent and terrible was rising. It looked like a cathedral made of earth and light reaching toward the sky with spires that defied gravity. "It's beautiful," Martinez said, joining her at the window. "In a terrifying way." "They turned my sanctuary into something else," Clara said. "But maybe that's what it always was, a place of growth, of life. They're just growing something different." "You sound like you're defending them." I'm trying to understand them. There's a difference. Martinez was quiet for a moment, then, what if we can't? What if they're too different, too alien for us to ever understand? Clara thought about the message on her phone, about the recognition of kindness, about the careful avoidance of harm. They understand us well enough. They know our technology, our infrastructure, our communication methods. They've been studying us for who knows how long. The question is whether we're capable of the same understanding in return. A commotion near the command post drew their attention. A young woman had arrived escorted by state troopers carrying something wrapped in a blanket. Chen and the other scientists gathered around her as she carefully unwrapped her burden. Clara moved closer and gasped at what she saw. It was one of the builders, but dead or dormant. Up close she could see details that had been impossible to discern when they were moving. The creature was intricate beyond belief, with a body that seemed to be part organic, part mineral. Its surface was covered in patterns that looked almost like circuitry, or maybe writing in a language that predated human speech. "Where did you find this?" Chen asked the woman. "It was in my basement," she replied, her voice shaking. "It's been there for years. My grandmother kept it in a jar, said her grandmother had found it in the walls when they built the house in 1892. She said it was a warning, but she never said what it was warning about." Chen carefully lifted the creature, studying it under a portable microscope. "This changes everything. If they've been here that long, if they've been dormant until now..." "What triggered them?" Clara asked. "What made them wake up?" Chen looked up from the microscope, her face pale. Maybe it wasn't something that triggered them. Maybe it was something approaching, something they've been waiting for, something they knew was coming. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The emergency generator had failed. But the room wasn't dark. The phosphorescent glow from outside provided enough light to see painting everything in shades of blue and green. In that alien light, Clara saw Chen's expression change from fear to determination. "We need to establish real communication, not just images and messages, but actual dialogue. If they know something's coming, if they're trying to help, we need to understand what we're facing. How do we talk to something that builds with its body and speaks in phosphorescence?" the guard commander asked. "We learn," Clara said simply. "We adapt. It's what humans have always done." Outside, the construction continued, and the night deepened, and the world continued its transformation. But for the first time since her garden had been invaded, Clara felt something other than fear. She felt possibility. The builders hadn't destroyed her sanctuary. They had revealed that the entire earth was a sanctuary, and they were working to preserve it. The question was, would humanity accept their help, or would pride and fear lead them to fight a war against the only things that might save them from whatever was coming? As she watched the impossible structures rise against the starred sky, Clara knew that the next few days would determine not just the fate of her neighborhood, but possibly the future of human civilization. The silent expansion was over. Now came the hard part, learning to live with what had been revealed. Duke whined softly, and she stroked his graying fur. "I know, boy. I'm scared too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared together is better than being brave alone." In the distance, she could hear helicopters approaching, bringing more scientists, more soldiers, more questions. But underneath it all, steady as a heartbeat, was the sound of building. The builders had work to do, and 3 years wasn't very long at all. The transformation of Magnolia Street continued through the night, each hour, bringing new impossibilities, new structures that challenged human understanding of physics and architecture. Clara stayed at her post, treating injuries and documenting symptoms, but her mind kept returning to that 3-year deadline. What could threaten creatures that had survived beneath the earth for millions of years? What could be so terrible that they would reveal themselves to humanity, their ancient secret exposed just to offer shelter? As dawn approached, painting the alien landscape in shades of gold and amber, Clara got her first hint of an answer. The builders had constructed something new in the night, a tower that rose 100 feet into the air, its surface covered in the same patterns as the dormant creature's body. At its apex, something was forming, something that looked disturbingly like an eye. But it wasn't looking at the earth. It was looking up, searching the sky for something that hadn't arrived yet. Something the builders knew was coming. Something that had been coming for a very long time. The eye atop the tower blinked. Clara saw it happen, a deliberate conscious movement that sent ice through her veins. Around her, the assembled scientists and military personnel fell silent, all watching as the structure revealed its true nature. It wasn't just watching the sky anymore. It was scanning, searching, cataloging everything within its field of vision with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. "Get everyone back inside," Dr. Chen commanded, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Now." But even as people scrambled for the community center's doors, Clara noticed the builders' behavior changing. They were emerging from every opening, every crack, moving with an urgency she hadn't seen before. Their phosphorescent bodies pulsed in rapid patterns like a visible heartbeat of panic. "Something's wrong," she said to Duke, who was pressed so tightly against her leg she could feel him trembling. "They're afraid." The ground began to vibrate, not with the rhythmic pulsing they'd grown accustomed to, but with sharp staccato bursts that felt like warnings. Through the windows of the community center, Clara watched as the builders began to reinforce their structures, adding layers upon layers of that hardened secretion, turning their delicate architecture into something resembling fortification. "Incoming," someone shouted, and Clara looked up to see military helicopters approaching from the south. But these weren't the transport helicopters that had been arriving all night. These were Apache gunships, armed and moving in attack formation. "What are they doing?" Chen grabbed the guard commander's radio. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen with the CDC. Those helicopters need to stand down immediately. We have a no-engagement protocol." Her words were cut off by the sound of missiles launching. Clara watched in horror as the rocket streaked toward the tower with its watching eye. Time seemed to slow as the weapons approached their target, and then something impossible happened. The air around the tower shimmered, and the missiles simply disappeared. Not exploded, not deflected, they ceased to exist, leaving only wisps of smoke to mark their passing. The response was immediate and terrifying. Every builder in sight stopped what they were doing and turned toward the helicopters. Their bodies began to pulse in unison, that phosphorescent glow intensifying until it was painful to look at directly. The sound that emerged from them was unlike anything Clara had heard, part scream, part siren, part something that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to primitive fear centers in the brain. "Get down!" the guard commander shouted, pulling people to the floor. The windows of the community center exploded inward, but not from any physical force. The glass simply dissolved, transforming into a fine sand that hung in the air like mist. Through the now open walls, Clara could see the builders moving toward them. Not walking or crawling, but flowing like a single organism made of thousands of individual parts. "They're swarming," Martinez said, his medical composure finally cracking. "God help us, they're actually swarming." But even as panic seized the room, Clara noticed something crucial. The builders weren't attacking people. They were moving past them, through them, around them, heading for something else entirely. She followed their movement and realized they were converging on the helicopters, which were now trying to gain altitude and retreat. It was too late. The swarm reached the first Apache, and the aircraft simply came apart, not in an explosion, but in a careful, methodical disassembly. Every bolt, every wire, every component was separated and cataloged, the pieces falling to earth like technological rain. The pilots ejected, and Clara held her breath, waiting for the builders to turn on them. But the swarm parted, allowing the parachutes to descend unmolested. "They're not killing," she said loud enough for others to hear. "Look, they're disabling the weapons but not harming the people." Chen was already on her satellite phone shouting at someone. "Call off the attack. I don't care who authorized it. Call it off now. They're showing restraint, but if we keep pushing..." The second helicopter met the same fate as the first, dissolving into components in midair. The third tried to fire its cannon, the sound of the chain gun brutal in the morning air, but the bullets had no effect. They passed through the swarm like rain through smoke, and then that helicopter too was methodically dismantled. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The builders retreated, flowing back to their structures, resuming their construction as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the confrontation was the field of helicopter parts scattered across 3 blocks, and the profound silence that followed. "Nobody move," Chen said quietly. "Nobody do anything aggressive. We've just seen what they're capable of, and they chose not to use it against us. Let's not give them a reason to reconsider." Clara slowly got to her feet. Duke still pressed against her. Through the dissolved windows, she could see the eye atop the tower had turned to look directly at the community center. She felt its gaze like a physical weight, assessing, evaluating, deciding. Then, impossibly, she heard a voice. Not through her ears, but somehow inside her mind, speaking in concepts, rather than words, but translating into something she could understand. The violent ones make things harder. Time grows short. The burning comes whether you accept shelter or not. Choose. Did anyone else hear that, she asked, and from the shocked expressions around her it was clear they had. Chen was the first to recover. It's telepathic, or something like it. They're in our heads. No, Clara corrected, understanding somehow flowing into her mind. They're translating. They've always communicated through chemical signals, pheromones, vibrations. They've learned to translate that into something we can perceive. The voice came again, and this time Clara recognized something in it. Exhaustion, frustration, and underneath it all, genuine fear. Your kind attacks what it doesn't understand. We revealed ourselves to save, not to harm. But the swarm remembers when your kind burned our ancestors, when you poisoned our homes with your chemicals. Trust is hard. Time is short. The burning comes in 3 rotations of your world around your star. Choose. Who are you? Chen called out to the empty air. What are you? The response came not in words, but in images that appeared directly in their minds. Clara saw the Earth as it was billions of years ago, young and violent, and she saw the first builders arriving not from space, but from somewhere else, somewhere between spaces. They came as refugees from a universe that had burned seeking shelter in the deep, cool places of this new world. She saw them building their first cities in the spaces between molecules and the gaps in reality that larger creatures couldn't perceive. For eons, they lived in peace, evolving, growing, becoming part of Earth's hidden ecosystem. They were here when the first life emerged from the seas. They were here when the dinosaurs ruled and when they fell. They were here when humanity took its first stumbling steps. And through it all, they watched the sky because they knew the burning would come again. It always did. Every universe eventually discovered fire, and fire always spread. The star plague, the voice explained, and Clara saw images of other worlds, other civilizations that had faced what was coming. It spreads from star to star, consuming light, converting matter to energy in ways your science cannot yet understand. We have seen it before. We fled from it before. Now there is nowhere left to flee. So you're building shelters, Clara said, understanding flooding through her. You're trying to save the Earth. Trying to save what can be saved. The surface will burn, the sky will fall, but in the deep places and the spaces between life can continue. We build. You choose. The guard commander, recovering from his shock, stepped forward. If this threat is real, why haven't our astronomers detected it? The answer came with another flood of images, the star plague moving through dimensions human instruments couldn't detect, approaching from angles that three-dimensional thinking couldn't comprehend. By the time human science could see it, it would be far too late. Show us, Chen demanded. If you want us to trust you, show us proof. The eye atop the tower pulsed, and suddenly every electronic device in the community center came alive. Screens showed images from deep space from instruments that didn't exist in human technology. Clara saw something that made her mind rebel, a darkness that wasn't empty space, but something actively consuming light spreading from star system to star system like a cosmic infection. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. It's real. The mathematics appeared on screens, equations that humanity's brightest minds would take years to fully understand, but the conclusion was clear. 3 years. They had 3 years before that consuming darkness reached Earth. The governments of the world need to know, Chen said, already reaching for her phone. Everyone needs to know. They won't believe, the voice said, carrying tones of bitter experience. Your kind never believes until the burning begins. But some will listen. Some always do. For them we build. Clara stepped forward, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. My garden. You chose my garden. Why, the response was gentler this time, almost warm. You nurtured life without seeking to control it. You understood growth, patience, symbiosis. The earth there remembered your kindness. We built where love had prepared the ground. Tears stung Clara's eyes. Her sanctuary hadn't been destroyed. It had been transformed into something larger, something necessary. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "Understanding, cooperation, time." The voice paused, and when it continued, there was something almost like hope in it. "Your kind and ours working together might save more than either could alone, but first the attacks must stop." Chen was already coordinating, making calls, sending messages. The attempted helicopter attack had been unauthorized, a panic response from some military authority who decided to act without understanding. Now she was working to prevent any further incidents. But even as order was being restored, Clara could feel the tension in the air. Humanity had just learned it wasn't alone, that it had never been alone, and that something catastrophic was approaching. How would 7 billion people react to such news? The answer came sooner than expected. Within hours, the story had leaked. Videos of the helicopter disassembly, photographs of the tower with its watching eye, testimonies from witnesses, it all hit the internet simultaneously. The government tried to contain it, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a screen door. By nightfall, Magnolia Street had become the center of the world's attention. News crews set up outside the military perimeter. Protesters arrived, some calling the builders demons, others angels. Scientists flew in from every corner of the globe. Religious leaders proclaimed everything from the end times to the second coming. Through it all, the builders continued their work, apparently unconcerned with human panic. Their structures grew more complex by the hour, and Clara began to understand that they weren't just building shelters, they were building an entire infrastructure for survival. "Look at this," Martinez called her over to where he was studying a display showing underground mapping. "The tunnel systems aren't random. They're connecting every major freshwater source in North America. And here," he pointed to deeper scans, "they're tapping into geothermal energy. They're creating a completely self-sustaining ecosystem." "How many people could it support?" Clara asked. Martinez did quick calculations. "If they're as efficient as they appear to be, millions, maybe tens of millions." "Out of 7 billion, Clara said quietly. The weight of that number hung between them. Even if the builders' shelters worked perfectly, most of humanity wouldn't survive what was coming. The question was who would be chosen. Who would decide? That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window watching the builders work in their phosphorescent light. Duke hadn't left her side all day, and she could feel his steady breathing as he dozed at her feet. Around her, the community center had transformed into a makeshift command post with scientists, military personnel, and government officials working around the clock to understand and respond to the crisis. "Can't sleep either." Chen appeared beside her, looking exhausted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that darkness spreading across the stars," Clara admitted. "How do we tell people that the world is ending?" "We don't," Chen said. "We tell them it's changing, that there's hope if we're smart enough to take it." "Will we be?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Humans are capable of incredible cooperation in the face of disaster, but also incredible stupidity. The next few days will tell us which impulse wins." A commotion outside drew their attention. A group of people had broken through the perimeter, not protesters or journalists, but ordinary citizens carrying shovels and picks. They were heading for one of the builder mounds, clearly intending to destroy it. "Stop them," Chen said urgently into her radio. "Non-lethal force only, but stop them now." The National Guard moved to intercept, but they were too late. The group reached the mound and began attacking it with their tools. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mound erupted. The swarm that emerged was different from before, darker, more aggressive. These weren't the patient builders who had been constructing shelters. These were defenders, and they moved with terrifying purpose. The attackers screamed, dropping their tools and trying to run, but the swarm engulfed them. Clara watched in horror, expecting to see them torn apart. But instead, something else happened. The swarm held them suspended in midair and then began to glow with that familiar phosphorescence. The screaming stopped. The attackers' eyes went wide, then vacant, then filled with something Clara could only describe as understanding. One by one, the swarm released them, and they fell to their knees, sobbing. "What did you do to them?" Chen demanded through a bullhorn. The voice responded, audible to everyone this time. "We showed them." showed them what comes, showed them what will be lost if humanity fights itself instead of preparing. They understand now. One of the attackers, a middle-aged man who'd been carrying a sledgehammer, looked up with tears streaming down his face. "I saw it," he said, his voice breaking. "I saw the earth burning. I saw my children. We have to help them. We have to help them save us." It was a turning point. Word spread quickly about what the swarm had shown the attackers. Some called it brainwashing, others called it revelation. But more and more people began to arrive not to protest or attack, but to offer help. Engineers came with equipment and expertise. Construction workers brought materials. Scientists brought knowledge. Even children came offering drawings and toys to leave at the base of the mounds, as if making offerings to mysterious friends. The builders responded by adjusting their construction, creating spaces more suitable for human habitation, adding air filtration systems that human lungs could use, incorporating human technology into their designs. It was still alien, still impossible by human standards, but it was becoming something hybrid, something both species could use. Clara found herself serving as an unofficial liaison, her early contact with the builders giving her a unique position. She helped coordinate between human workers and the swarm, translating needs and concerns in both directions. "They learned so fast," she told Chen after a particularly productive day. "They've absorbed thousands of years of human engineering knowledge in hours. They're incorporating our best ideas into their designs, improving them in ways we never imagined." "It's not just engineering," Chen replied. "They're learning our languages, our cultures, our fears. They're trying to become something we can work with." But not everyone was ready to cooperate. On the third day after the swarm event, Clara woke to explosions. Not nearby, but visible on the news feeds, military strikes against builder sites in China, Russia, and North Korea. Governments that saw the builders not as saviors, but as threats to their sovereignty. The response was swift and terrible. Every builder site around the world pulsed in unison, sending out a wave of energy that disabled every military system on the planet. Planes fell from the sky, their electronics fried. Ships went dead in the water. Nuclear arsenals went dark. In seconds, humanity's capacity for large-scale warfare was erased. "No more weapons," the voice said, echoing across the planet, heard by every human simultaneously. "No more time for your wars. Build with us or perish alone. Choose now." The silence that followed was deafening. Humanity had just been disarmed by a species that could have destroyed them at any time but had chosen not to. The power dynamic was clear, but so was the offer: cooperation and survival, or isolation and death. Clara stood in her garden, or what had been her garden. The structure the builders had created there was beautiful in its alien way, reaching toward the sky while also burrowing deep into the earth. She could feel the life within it, the purpose, the desperate hope. "We'll help," she said aloud, knowing they could hear her. "Not all of us, but enough. We'll help you save what can be saved." The structure pulsed with warm light, and for a moment Clara felt their gratitude vast and ancient and tinged with a sadness born of seeing too many worlds burn. Duke nuzzled her hand and she scratched behind his ears. 3 years, boy. Think we can learn to live underground." He looked up at her with those wise amber eyes, and she could have sworn he understood. They'd adapted before. They'd adapt again. It was what living things did: change or die. Around her, humans and builders worked side by side, racing against a clock that counted down to the end of the world as they knew it. But in that cooperation, in that desperate alliance between species that had shared a world without knowing it, Clara saw something that gave her hope. They might not save everyone. They might not save most, but they would save some, and sometimes that was enough to start again. The swarm moved around her individual builders, passing close enough to touch, and Clara felt their recognition, their remembrance of the garden she'd tended with such care. In their alien way, they were saying thank you for the sanctuary she'd provided, for the peace she'd offered, for the bridge she'd become between two species that needed each other to survive. The burning was coming. The darkness between stars was spreading toward Earth with inexorable purpose. But in the deep places, in the spaces between, something new was growing: a fusion of human dreams and builder knowledge, of surface hope and deep wisdom. It wasn't the future anyone had imagined, but it was a future, and that was more than most dying worlds could claim. The first coordinated assault came at dawn, 6 days after the military systems had been disabled. Clara watched from the observation post they'd established in what remained of the community center as thousands of people marched toward the builder sites. They weren't military, those forces were still reeling from the loss of their technology. These were civilians armed with improvised weapons, Molotov cocktails, and a fervor that bordered on religious mania. They call themselves the Surface Defenders, Chen said, monitoring multiple feeds on her tablet. They believe the builders are demons, that accepting their help means surrendering our souls. Can't they see what's coming? Clara asked, though she knew the answer. Fear made people irrational, and nothing triggered fear quite like change this fundamental. The mob reached the perimeter that the National Guard had established, a perimeter they could no longer properly defend without their advanced weapons. The soldiers stood with riot shields and batons, but they were outnumbered 50-1. Fall back, the Guard commander ordered. All units fall back to secondary positions. As the soldiers retreated, the mob surged forward, their shouts echoing across the transformed landscape. Clara could hear their chants, "Earth for humans, drive them back to hell, God will protect the faithful." The builders' response was unlike anything they'd shown before. Instead of swarming, they began to sing. It wasn't sound in any conventional sense, it was vibration that penetrated everything air-earth-bone. It harmonized with itself in ways that human music never could, creating patterns that spoke directly to the mathematical foundations of reality. Clara felt it in her chest, in her teeth, in the beating of her heart. The mob slowed, confused. Some dropped their weapons, pressing hands to their ears, though that did nothing to stop the sensation. Others pushed forward, but their movements became sluggish, uncoordinated. Then the ground began to move. Not violently, not aggressively, but with purpose. The earth itself rose in waves, gentle but irresistible, carrying the attackers backward like a slow-motion tsunami in reverse. No one was hurt, but within minutes, the entire mob had been pushed back beyond the original perimeter. "They're showing restraint again," Martinez observed. "They could kill everyone here, but they're just relocating them." The song continued, and Clara began to understand that it wasn't just sound, it was communication on a level humans had never achieved. The builders were explaining teaching, sharing knowledge directly through vibration and resonance. Those who were open to it began to understand. She could see it in their faces, the rage replaced by wonder, then by terror, as they truly grasped what was approaching from the stars. But not everyone was receptive. A hardcore group of perhaps 200 people rallied their leader, a man named Marcus Pritchard, who'd been a local pastor before the emergence, shouting about resisting the devil's seduction. "Fire purifies," he screamed. "Burn them out!" The Molotov cocktails flew, creating a wall of flame between the humans and the builder's structures. For a moment, Clara thought it might work. Fire had always been humanity's first tool and weapon, but the builders had evolved far beyond such simple threats. The flames turned blue, then white, then began to twist into impossible shapes. The fire wasn't being extinguished, it was being transformed, converted into something else entirely. Where the flames had been, crystals began to grow beautiful and terrible, spreading across the ground in fractal patterns. "Energy conversion," one of the scientists breathed. "They're turning the fire into structure. They're using our attacks to build." Pritchard's group tried to retreat, but the crystals were spreading too fast. Not aggressively, they grew around the humans, never touching them, but creating a maze that guided them away from the builder sites. It was containment without imprisonment, defense without violence. Clara heard the voice in her mind again, tinged with what felt like disappointment. "Your species wastes so much energy on destruction. We try to show you how to build instead. Why do you resist survival?" She found herself answering aloud, knowing they would hear. "Because we're afraid. Because accepting help means admitting we're not in control. Humans have always been the dominant species on Earth's surface. This changes everything. Everything changes regardless. The burning comes whether you accept it or not. We offer choice where there would be none." A new commotion drew Clara's attention. Military vehicles were approaching not American, but Chinese. Despite the global disarmament, some nations were still trying to mount resistance using purely mechanical means. The tanks that rolled toward the builder sites were old diesel-powered, with no electronics that could be disabled. "They're going to fire," Chen said, reading intelligence reports on her phone. "Beijing has decided the builders are an invasion force. They're implementing something called Protocol 7. What's Protocol 7? I don't know, but the tanks fired simultaneously, their shells arcing toward the largest builder structure. But instead of impact, the projectiles slowed, stopped, and hung in midair, rotating slowly as if being examined. Then they began to disassemble, just like the helicopters had. But this time the builders did something with the components. They reformed them, reshaped them, turning weapons into something else entirely. Where the shells had been mechanical flowers bloomed in the air, intricate, beautiful, impossible. They drifted down like snow, and where they touched the ground, new structures began to grow. They're not just defending, Clara realized. They're teaching. Every attack becomes a lesson in transformation. The Chinese tanks tried to retreat, but the ground beneath them had become soft, not quite liquid, but no longer solid. They sank slowly, gently, until only their turrets remained above ground. The crews evacuated unharmed, but humbled, and the builders began to transform the abandoned vehicles into something useful. Clara could see them being converted into what looked like water purification systems. But the conflict was far from over. Reports were coming in from around the world, riots in major cities, religious groups proclaiming the end times government struggling to maintain order as their populations divided between those who wanted to cooperate with the builders and those who saw them as an existential threat. We need a unified response, Chen said during an emergency video conference with world leaders. The builders have made it clear we work together or we face extinction. You ask us to surrender to alien invaders, the Russian president responded coldly. I ask you to accept help from a species that could have destroyed us at any time, but chose to try saving us instead, Chen countered. The argument continued for hours, but Clara had stopped listening. She was watching Duke, who had been increasingly agitated all day. Now he was pawing at the ground, whining in a way she'd never heard before. What is it, boy? She knelt beside him, and that's when she felt it, a vibration different from the builder's usual resonance. This was sharper, more aggressive, like a drill bit grinding through stone. The floor cracked beneath her feet. Everyone out, she shouted, grabbing Duke's collar and running for the exit. They barely made it outside before the community center floor erupted. But what emerged wasn't the flowing, coordinated swarm of builders. These were different, darker, more angular, moving with predatory purpose. They looked like corrupted versions of the builders twisted into something hostile. Variants, the voice in Clara's mind said, and for the first time she heard fear in it. We are not the only ones who flee the burning. Others come, others who consume rather than create. They follow our tunnels, use our work. We had hoped they would not find this world so soon. The corrupted creatures, Clara thought of them as destroyers spread out from the whole, and wherever they touched, things began to decay. Plants withered, concrete crumbled, even the air seemed to grow thick and poisonous around them. The builders' response was immediate. The swarm converged from every direction, meeting the destroyers in what could only be described as battle. It was like watching two fluids mix and react, the phosphorescent glow of the builders clashing with the dark corruption of the invaders. Chemical warfare, Martinez said, watching in horrified fascination. They're fighting with chemistry, with physics itself. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The builders were winning, their numbers were greater, their coordination better, but victory came at a cost. Thousands of individual builders were destroyed. Their light extinguished, their contribution to the collective consciousness lost forever. When it was over, the destroyers were gone, dissolved, or driven back into the deep. But the damage was done. Where the battle had taken place, nothing would grow for years. The soil itself had been poisoned at a molecular level. There will be more, the voice said, exhausted and sad. The burning drives many species before it. Not all seek shelter, some seek conquest. We must build faster, stronger, deeper. And your kind must decide, will you help us defend this world, or will you continue to fight us while greater threats gather? The answer came from an unexpected source. Pritchard, the pastor who had led the morning's attack, stepped forward. His face was pale, his hands shaking, but his voice was steady. I was wrong, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I thought you were demons, but demons don't defend. Demons don't build shelters for others. Demons don't sacrifice themselves to protect those who attack them. He turned to his followers, many of whom were still trapped in the crystal maze. We've been fighting the wrong enemy. The real darkness is coming, and these builders are trying to save us from it. It wasn't a complete conversion. Many of his followers looked skeptical, even betrayed. But it was a start, and as word spread of the destroyers of the battle beneath the community center, more people began to understand that the situation was more complex than invasion versus resistance. Chen seized the moment, broadcasting globally. We've just witnessed proof that the builders aren't our enemy. They fought to protect us from something worse. The question now isn't whether we accept their help, but whether we can afford to refuse it. The next few days saw a dramatic shift in the global response. Scientists who had been studying the builder technology made breakthrough after breakthrough each discovery, reinforcing the same conclusion: the shelters being constructed weren't just refuges. They were arcs designed to preserve not just human life, but Earth's entire biosphere. Look at this. Dr. James Patterson, a biologist from MIT, showed Clara a cross-section of one of the structures. They're creating perfect microenvironments. This section here is replicating Amazon rainforest conditions. This one is Arctic tundra. They're not just saving us, they're saving everything. But why? Clara asked. Why do they care about Earth's biodiversity? The answer came from the builders directly: life is rare. Each world that develops it creates unique solutions to existence. To lose any species is to lose millions of years of evolution, of problem-solving, of beauty. We are gardeners of necessity. We preserve what the burning would destroy and hope that someday, somewhere, it can grow again. Clara thought of her own garden, how she'd carefully tended each plant, each small ecosystem. The builders were doing the same thing, just on a planetary scale. But even as cooperation increased, time was running short. Astronomers using builder-enhanced equipment had detected the first signs of the approaching catastrophe. Stars at the edge of the solar system were showing unusual fluctuations, their light patterns disrupted by something that existed partially outside normal space-time. 2 years, 8 months, Chen announced at a global summit. That's our best estimate. After that, the surface of Earth will be uninhabitable for at least a century, possibly longer. The numbers were staggering. Even with builder help, they could only shelter perhaps 100 million people in the time remaining. Decisions had to be made about who would be saved, and those decisions were tearing humanity apart. Some nations proposed lotteries. Others wanted to save only the young, or only the skilled, or only the genetically diverse. The arguments grew heated, then violent. Wars broke out not with advanced weapons, which no longer functioned, but with ancient ones: stones and clubs and bare hands. Humanity reverting to its most primitive state, even as it faced its most advanced challenge. The builders watched it all with what Clara could only interpret as sadness. They continued building, continued offering shelter to any who would accept it, but she could feel their disappointment through the psychic connection that had developed. "You were right about us," she told them one evening, standing in the ruins of her garden. "We do waste energy on destruction. Even facing extinction, we can't stop fighting each other. Yet some of you transcend. Some of you build despite the chaos. Some of you choose creation over destruction. For them, we continue." Duke leaned against her leg, and she realized he'd grown thin. The stress of the past weeks had affected everyone, but the animals seemed to understand something humans struggled with, that the world had fundamentally changed, and adaptation was the only option. That night, Clara made a decision. She gathered the medical staff who'd been working with her and proposed something radical. "We can't save everyone," she said, "but we can save our community." The builders respond to local action, to people who work together. Instead of waiting for the government to decide who lives and dies, we start selecting people ourselves: families with children, essential workers, people who've shown they can cooperate. We create our own arc. It was controversial, but it was also practical. Within days, Magnolia Street had become a model for community-based survival. People were selected not by lottery or genetics, but by their willingness to work together to contribute to adapt. The builders responded by creating specialized shelters designed specifically for the groups that were forming. Each community's shelter reflected its needs, its culture, its dreams for what life underground might become. But even as hope began to bloom, new challenges emerged. The destroyers returned in greater numbers this time. Other species fleeing the burning arrived, some hostile, some simply desperate, all competing for the safety the builders were creating. The battle beneath the soil had become a war fought in dimensions humans could barely perceive. The builders were strong, but they were also tired, having fled from world to world for longer than human civilization had existed. They needed help, and increasingly humans were providing it. Engineers worked alongside the swarm, learning to manipulate matter at the quantum level. Biologists helped design ecosystems that could thrive in artificial environments. Artists created beauty that transcended species, finding ways to make the shelters not just survivable, but livable. Clara found herself at the center of it all, not because she'd sought the position, but because she'd been there from the beginning. She'd seen the first mound in her garden, had witnessed the transformation from mystery to threat to desperate hope. People trusted her, both human and builder, and that trust came with responsibility. "We need more time," Chen said during one of their planning sessions. "At the current rate, we'll only complete 60% of the minimum shelters needed." "Then we build faster," Claire replied. "We stop fighting and start building like our lives depend on it." Because they do. The next morning brought a new development. The builders had constructed something overnight, a massive crystalline structure that towered above the ruins of the neighborhood. It pulsed with energy that made the air itself sing. "It's a beacon," the voice explained. "A call to others of our kind who might be nearby, who might come to help. But it also risks attracting more destroyers, more competing species. We build it because we must, but the danger increases." Clara understood. They were gambling, risking greater immediate danger for the chance of greater long-term survival. It was a fundamentally human choice, which made her realize how similar the two species really were beneath their vast differences. The beacon's call was answered within days. New builders arrived different from the first. Some resembled living crystal. Others moved like liquid metal. Still others seemed to exist partially in other dimensions. Each brought unique construction techniques, unique solutions to the challenge of preserving life. But they also brought warnings. The burning was worse than the original builders had thought. It wasn't just consuming star systems, it was unraveling the fundamental forces that held reality together. Even the deep shelters might not be enough if the phenomenon continued to accelerate. "There is another option," one of the new arrivals communicated. Clara perceived it as a presence of infinite complexity, fractalized thought patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. "We can attempt translation." Translation. Moving not just underground but sideways into parallel spaces where the burning cannot reach. But the risk is enormous. Many who attempt it are lost between realities neither here nor there, existing in spaces that thought cannot map. It was an impossible choice: certain death on the surface, possible survival underground, or the risk of something worse than death in dimensions humanity had never imagined. But that choice would have to be made soon. The astronomers were detecting new anomalies daily. Stars were going dark in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, malevolence. Whatever the burning truly was, it was coming faster than anticipated. 2 years, Chen announced grimly. Maybe less. We've run out of time to debate. We build or we die. The world's response was immediate and dramatic. The remaining governments declared a state of global emergency. All resources were redirected to the shelter projects. Humanity's greatest minds worked alongside builder consciousness to solve problems that had seemed impossible weeks before. Cities were abandoned as people moved to shelter sites. The global economy collapsed, replaced by a simple exchange work for salvation. Those who contributed to the building earned places in the shelters. Those who refused or resisted were left to face whatever came. It was brutal, it was unfair, and it was necessary. Clara watched from the hill that had once overlooked her neighborhood as the transformation accelerated. Where suburban homes had stood, massive structures now reached both skyward and deep into the earth. The landscape looked alien, unworldly, like something from a fever dream. But it was also beautiful in its own way. The builder architecture had an organic quality, as if the structures had grown rather than been built. They caught the light in ways that suggested there was more to them than three-dimensional forms, that they existed partially in spaces human eyes couldn't quite perceive. Duke stood beside her, his gray muzzle lifted to the wind. He'd adapted to the changes better than most humans, accepting the new reality with the pragmatism that animals possessed. He knew that the world had changed, that the old territories and hierarchies no longer mattered. What mattered was survival, and the pack, human and builder alike, that offered the best chance for it. "We might actually do this," Clara said, partly to Duke, partly to herself, partly to the builders she knew were listening. "We might actually save something worth saving." The response came not in words, but in feeling hope tempered by experience, determination tinged with sorrow. For all that would be lost, and underneath it all, a fierce protectiveness for the small blue world that had become their last stand against the burning dark. The battle beneath the soil wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time since that small mound had appeared in her garden, Clara believed they might win, not the war against the burning, which seemed unstoppable, but the fight to preserve something of earth, something of humanity, something of the beauty and diversity that had taken billions of years to evolve. The shelters would be ready, not for everyone, not even for most, but for enough. Enough to start again when the burning passed. Enough to remember what had been and dream of what might be again. And in the deep places in the spaces between life would continue. The morning they poured the concrete was the morning Clara finally understood the true cost of salvation. She stood at the edge of what had been her property line, though such boundaries meant nothing now watching as massive trucks arrived in an endless convoy. The concrete wasn't ordinary, the builders had transformed it at the molecular level, infusing it with their chemistry, their intelligence, their desperate hope. 500,000 tons, Chen said, standing beside her with a tablet showing the logistics. The largest pour in human history. And this is just one site. Around the world, similar operations were underway. The builders had revealed that concrete, simple ancient concrete, could be transformed into something that might withstand the burning. Not the concrete itself, but the shapes it would preserve, the spaces it would define, the memory it would hold of what had grown within it. Duke pressed against Clara's leg, whimpering softly. He'd been doing that more lately, sensing something in the air that humans couldn't perceive. The animals always knew first. "Begin the pour," the voice commanded, not just in Clara's mind, but in every mind present. The collective consciousness of the builders had grown stronger, as more arrived, their individual voices blending into something that felt vast and ancient and desperately afraid. The concrete flowed like water, but water with purpose. It found every tunnel, every chamber, every carefully crafted space the builders had created. But it didn't fill them. Instead, it formed shells around them, preserving them like insects in amber. The builders themselves moved through it, their bodies somehow passing through the liquid stone as if it wasn't there, adding their secretions, their chemistry, their biological engineering to transform construction material into something alive. "They're encoding themselves into it, Doctor," Patterson said, watching through an electron microscope feed. "The concrete is becoming a storage medium. They're writing their entire civilization into stone." It wasn't just their civilization. As Clara watched, she saw humans being led into specific chambers before the concrete reached them. Volunteers the first to enter the deep shelters, trusting in alien technology they couldn't fully understand. "Mom, please don't do this." Clara turned to find her daughter Sarah, whom she hadn't seen in 3 years. Sarah had driven from Houston when the news broke, arriving just as the final phase began. She looked exhausted, terrified, and desperately afraid for her mother. "I have to," Clara said, pulling her daughter into an embrace. "I was here at the beginning. I need to see it through." "But the concrete, what if you can't get out? What if it doesn't work?" Clara didn't have an answer that would comfort her daughter. The truth was, no one knew if the preservation process would work. The builders claimed it would suspend human biological functions, keeping them alive but dormant until the burning passed. But their chemistry was different from human chemistry. What worked for them might kill humans instantly. "Your father called," Sarah said, and Clara stiffened. Marcus had left 8 years ago, but apparently the end of the world was enough to make him reach out. "He wants to know if you're on the preservation list." "Everyone who's contributed is on the list," Clara said carefully. "Even those who left." Sarah's expression darkened. "He doesn't deserve—" "None of us deserve this," Clara interrupted. "We're not being saved because we're worthy. We're being saved because we're here, because we're willing to try, because the builders believe life, any life, is worth preserving." The ground shook, not from construction, but from something deeper. The destroyers were attacking again, trying to break through before the concrete sealed everything. Clara could feel the battle raging below, transmitted through vibrations that made her teeth ache. "Combat positions," the guard commander ordered, though everyone knew conventional weapons were useless. The real fight was happening in dimensions humans couldn't perceive, chemistry and physics weaponized in ways that made nuclear weapons seem primitive. The builders' response was immediate and total. Every structure they'd built began to pulse in synchronization, creating a resonance that Clara felt in her bones. The attacking destroyers were repelled, dissolved, transformed into base elements that the builders immediately incorporated into their defenses. But the victory came at a cost. Thousands of builders died in the defense, their lights extinguishing one by one. The collective voice grew quieter, more strained. "We weaken," it admitted. "Each battle costs us. Soon we will not have enough to maintain the preservation. You must decide now, enter the shelters or face what comes above." The decision rippled through the crowd. Some ran toward the designated entry points. Others backed away, unable to commit to such an uncertain future. Families were torn apart as some members chose preservation, while others chose to remain on the surface. Clara watched it all with the clinical detachment she'd developed as an emergency room nurse. This was triage on a species level. Save who you could, except that you couldn't save everyone. Move on to the next patient. "Dr. Whitfield." Chen approached with a grim expression. "We've received intelligence from Beijing. They're planning to nuclear strike the sites. But the weapons won't work. They've rebuilt them. Purely mechanical triggers, no electronics. They'll work." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Nuclear weapons against the builder sites wouldn't just destroy the structures, they'd irradiate the ground for miles, making the shelters death traps instead of sanctuaries. Can the builders defend against them? We're about to find out. The missiles appeared on the horizon like dark fingers pointing at the sky. Intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from submarines that had been retrofitted with mechanical systems. Humanity's last gesture of defiance against salvation. The builders' response was unlike anything Clara had witnessed. Instead of destroying or deflecting the missiles, they began to sing again, that deep resonant harmony that spoke to the fundamental forces of reality. The missiles slowed their trajectories, bending in impossible ways. They began to orbit the builder sites, caught in gravitational fields that shouldn't exist. Then, one by one, they began to transform. The nuclear material within them shifted its atomic structure, reconfiguring. Plutonium became lead, then iron, then something else entirely, a material that glowed with the same phosphorescence as the builders themselves. The missiles became seeds falling to Earth and immediately sprouting into new structures, new shelters, new hope. "They turned our weapons into gardens," someone whispered in awe. China's response was immediate and predictable. They declared the builders an existential threat to human sovereignty and called for global resistance. But their call fell on exhausted ears. Humanity was tired of fighting, tired of resisting, tired of pretending they could face the burning alone. The concrete continued to flow, and more people made their choice. The shelters were filling rapidly now, each person who entered adding their biological and cultural information to the vast database the builders were creating. It wasn't just preservation, it was documentation, everything. Humanity was. Everything it had achieved was being encoded into stone and soil and the spaces between atoms. Clara found herself in the medical facility they'd established at the primary entry point. She was treating last-minute injuries, administering sedatives to those too frightened to enter the preservation chambers conscious, saying goodbye to those who'd chosen to stay above. "You're going to be alone," she told Martinez, who decided to remain on the surface. "When we're all gone, you'll be alone." "Someone needs to witness," he replied. "Someone needs to see what happens to document it for whoever comes after. Maybe the shelters will work, maybe they won't. But someone should record the truth." She hugged him, knowing it was the last time she'd see him. He'd chosen his fate just as she'd chosen hers. The final day arrived faster than expected. Astronomical observations showed the burning had accelerated, feeding on the energy of the outer planets. Jupiter was gone, consumed in a conflagration that had been visible from Earth as a second sun in the night sky. Saturn was failing, its rings dissolved into cosmic ash. 12 hours, Chen announced. "That's our window. After that, the surface becomes uninhabitable." The rush to the shelters became a stampede. Those who'd hesitated now fought desperately for entry. The builders, weakened by constant battles with destroyers and other fleeing species, could barely maintain order. Several entry points collapsed, trapping thousands in spaces half transformed, neither surface nor shelter. Clara worked through it all, her medical training overriding her exhaustion. She treated crush injuries, panic attacks, the mysterious neurological damage that came from too much contact with builder chemistry. She worked until her hands shook, until her vision blurred, until Duke had to physically pull her toward the shelter entrance. "It's time," Sarah said, taking her mother's arm. "We have to go." Clara looked back at the world she'd known. The sky was already changing, taking on a bruised quality that had nothing to do with weather. The burning wasn't just fire, it was a fundamental unraveling of reality itself. The laws of physics were becoming suggestions then, memories, then nothing at all. They descended into the shelters, following paths that seemed to fold in on themselves, leading down and sideways and through spaces that hurt to perceive directly. The builders had created something that existed partially outside normal space-time, a pocket of stability in an increasingly unstable universe. The preservation chamber was nothing like Clara had expected. It wasn't a pod or a tank, but a garden, a perfect recreation of her backyard from before all this began. Every plant, every stone, every detail preserved in impossible clarity. "We remember," the voice said, gentle now, almost tender. "We remember what you loved, what gave you peace. In the long sleep you will dream of this, and when you wake, if you wake, you will have this memory to hold against the darkness." Clara lay down in the center of her recreated garden, Duke curling up beside her as he had so many evening before the world changed. Sarah took her hand, and around them the concrete began to flow. But it wasn't cold or suffocating. It was warm, almost amniotic, like being held by something vast and protective. Clara could feel the builders moving through it, adding their essence, their chemistry, their desperate hope that something would survive. "Sleep," the voice said, and it sounded like her grandmother, like her first love, like every kind word she'd ever heard. "Sleep and dream of gardens. We will wake you when it's safe, when the burning has passed, when the world is ready to grow again." The last thing Clara saw before the preservation took hold was a vision the builders shared the earth as it would be after the burning. The surface was scorched, the atmosphere gone, the oceans boiled away. But deep beneath in the shelters they'd built, in the spaces they'd preserved, life continued. Seeds waiting for rain that would come again eventually. Stories waiting to be retold. Love waiting to be remembered. And in that vision, she saw something else, other worlds, other species who'd survived similar burnings reaching out across the cosmos to share their own preservation, their own hope. The builders weren't unique. The burning wasn't the end. It was a test, a filter, a transformation that some civilizations survived and others didn't. Earth would survive. Changed, scarred, but alive. The builders had given them that gift at the cost of their own civilization. They would sleep too in the concrete and stone, waiting for someone to read their story to understand their sacrifice. Clara's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for her garden that had been chosen for the builders who'd tried to save them, for the concrete that would hold them safe through the burning dark. Then she slept and dreamed of gardens. Above the burning began. Martinez stood on the hill that overlooked what had been Magnolia Street, recording everything with equipment that would fail within hours as the fundamental forces that powered it dissolved. He watched the sky tear open, revealing colors that had no names, geometries that had no solutions. He watched reality itself crack and burn and transform into something else. The builder structures glowed brighter as the burning intensified their phosphorescence, fighting against the consuming dark. Some cracked, releasing clouds of spores that would drift in spaces between spaces, carrying the genetic and cultural information of Earth to distant corners of whatever remained of the universe. Others burrowed deeper, pulling the concrete shells with them, disappearing into dimensions that the burning couldn't reach. They took their precious cargo of preserved life with them, gambling on translation rather than simple preservation. Martinez documented it all, even as his equipment failed, even as the air became poison, even as his own body began to fail under the assault of radiations that shouldn't exist. He wrote with pencil on paper, then charcoal on stone, then finally just traced words in the ash that fell like snow. His last entry, carved into the concrete shell of Clara's shelter, was simple. They tried to save us. Some of them succeeded. Remember the builders. remember the gardens. Remember the choice to create rather than destroy. Then he too was gone, consumed by the burning that remade the world. Deep below, in spaces that existed between heartbeats and dimensions folded like origami, the preserved slept and dreamed. The builders sang to them through the stone lullabies in languages that predated speech stories of worlds that had been and worlds that might be again. The concrete held their shapes, their thoughts, their potential. It remembered the forms that had grown within it, the desperate hope that had shaped it, the sacrifice that had created it. When excavators would eventually crack it open, years, decades, centuries later, they would find perfect casts of impossible things. Creatures that had existed between dimensions, humans frozen in moments of transformation, gardens preserved in stone, waiting to bloom again. But that was still to come. For now there was only the burning above and the sleeping below, and the concrete that held the shape of what had been protecting it from what was preserving it for what might be. Clara slept in her stone garden duke faithful beside her Sarah's hand in hers. She dreamed of tomatoes heavy on the vine of soil, rich between her fingers, of the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful in a small space. She dreamed of the builders who'd recognized that beauty and tried to preserve it. She dreamed of worlds connected by shared survival of species that transcended their origins to become something greater. And in her dreams, the gardens grew. The burning raged for longer than predicted. Not 3 years, but 30, scouring the surface clean, resetting the fundamental forces, preparing the ground for something new. The earth became a blank canvas. Its surface turned to glass in some places, to crystal in others, to substances that had no names because no conscious being remained to name them. But in the deep places in the spaces between life waited. The builders had done more than preserve, they'd prepared. The shelters weren't just bunkers, but seeds designed to crack open when conditions were right to release their cargo of life back into a world ready to receive it. They'd encoded instructions into the very structure of the concrete lessons in survival, in cooperation, in the necessity of choosing creation over destruction. When the first shelter cracked open decades after the burning ended, what emerged wasn't human, wasn't builder, but something new. The preservation process had changed both species, blending them at levels too fundamental to separate. The beings that crawled from the concrete shells had human memories, and builder chemistry, human creativity and builder patience, human dreams and builder knowledge of the spaces between spaces. They looked at the scorched world with eyes that could perceive more than 3 dimensions, and they began to build, not as humans had built, not as builders had built, but as something new. Something born from the marriage of 2 species that had chosen cooperation over conflict in the face of extinction. Clara woke to a world she didn't recognize, but one she understood. The garden was gone, but the memory of it remained encoded in her transformed cells, in her expanded consciousness. Duke was there, changed but still faithful. His awareness expanded beyond anything either species had imagined possible. Sarah stood beside her, tears streaming down her face, if tears were the right word for the crystalline formations that expressed emotion in their new forms. "We survived," Sarah said, though speech was different now, more thought than sound. "No," Clara corrected, looking at their transformed bodies, at the wrong he of human and builder that they'd become. "We evolved." The world that awaited them was hostile, but not hopeless. The burning had passed, leaving scars, but also opportunities. Other shelters were opening, releasing their preserved cargo. Not just from Earth, the Builders' Network had saved fragments from dozens of worlds, all converging here, all ready to begin again. It would take centuries to rebuild millennia to heal the wounded Earth. But they had time now, and patience, and the hard-won knowledge that cooperation could triumph over destruction. Clara stood where her garden had been, though standing was different when your body could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She could feel the seeds still buried deep, protected by builder chemistry, waiting for the right moment to grow. She could feel the other survivors emerging from their concrete chrysalises, confused and frightened, but alive. "We have work to do," she said, and began to build. Not structures this time, but connections. Not shelters, but communities. Not preservation, but growth. The warning was clear, encoded in every transformed cell, every preserved memory. The burning would come again to this world or another. It was the nature of the universe, this cycle of creation and destruction. But next time, they would be ready. Next time, they would have the knowledge of the builders, the creativity of humanity, and the wisdom born from survival. The concrete shells remain monuments to desperation and hope. Scientists, if that word still applied to beings that could perceive quantum mechanics as easily as color, studied them, learning the full story of those final days. They found Martinez's words carved in stone and built a monument where he'd stood honoring the witness who'd chosen to document rather than preserve. They found the failed shelters where the process had gone wrong, where fear or violence had disrupted the preservation. These became memorials, reminders of the cost of conflict, of the price of choosing destruction over cooperation. And they found the messages the builders had hidden in the stone, in the spaces between molecules, in the quantum fluctuations of preserved matter. Messages of hope from other worlds that had survived other burnings. Maps to spaces between spaces where life flourished regardless of surface conditions. Instructions for technologies that could prevent future burnings, or at least predict them. Most importantly, they found the gardens. Not physical gardens, but the idea of them preserved in the concrete like insects in amber. The concept that beauty mattered, that small spaces could hold infinite possibility, that tending life was the highest calling any conscious being could aspire to. Clara, in her transformed state, became the keeper of these garden memories. She taught the new beings neither human nor builder, but something transcendent, how to nurture, how to tend, how to find peace and growth. She shared her memories of that first mound in her garden, of Duke's warning growl, of the moment she'd chosen understanding over fear. The earth healed slowly, steadily. The new beings, with their expanded consciousness and dimensional flexibility, could accelerate the process, could coax life from seemingly dead soil, could sing water from stone the way the builders had sung matter into new forms. Cities rose again, but not as they'd been. These were living structures grown rather than built, existing in harmony with the healing earth rather than in dominion over it. They were part garden, part shelter, part monument to the cooperation that had saved them all. And always, always, they remembered the warning encoded in the concrete in their transformed cells, in the very fabric of their new reality: the burning would come again. To this world or another, in this dimension or the next. It was the nature of existence, this cycle of growth and conflagration. But they also remembered the solution, the path through the fire that the builders had shown them. Cooperation, preservation. The choice to create rather than destroy. They remembered Clara's garden transformed into something impossible, but still somehow beautiful. They remembered the concrete that had held them safe, the sacrifice of those who'd fought to save them, the trust required to sleep through apocalypse and wake to possibility. The warning was clear, but so was the hope. Life found a way always if conscious beings chose to help, rather than hinder to build, rather than burn to preserve, rather than destroy. In the end, Clara's garden had saved them all. Not the physical space, but the idea of it. The notion that one person tending a small patch of earth with love and patience could create something worth preserving through the burning of worlds. The new earth turned scarred, but breathing, wounded, but healing. And in gardens, both literal and metaphorical. Impossible beings that had once been human and once been other, tended life with hands that could exist in multiple dimensions, with minds that could perceive the spaces between spaces, with hearts that remembered what it meant to choose creation over destruction. The warning had become a promise. The burning would come again, but so would the builders, the gardeners, the preservers. And next time they would be ready. Next time they would know that salvation came not from fighting the darkness, but from preserving the light. One garden at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of cooperation in the face of catastrophe. Clara stood in her new garden, in her transformed body, with her expanded consciousness, and planted seeds that would grow in dimensions humans had never imagined. Duke sat beside her, patient as always, watching for threats that might come from angles reality hadn't previously contained. And life, impossible and persistent, continued. 10 years had passed since the emergence from the concrete shells, though time itself had become a more fluid concept for the transformed beings that now inhabited Earth. Clara stood at the apex of what had once been Mount McKinley, though the mountain had been reformed into something that spiraled through dimensions rather than simply reaching toward the sky. From here, she could perceive the entire planet simultaneously, not just its physical surface, but the layers of reality the builders had taught them to navigate. Duke was with her as always. His transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. Where humans had gained builder consciousness, gradually overwhelming their neural pathways with alien thought patterns, Duke and the other animals had adapted instantly their simpler consciousness, expanding without the resistance of ego or expectation. He could now exist in 7 dimensions, simultaneously serving as an early warning system for threats that approached from angles humans still struggled to perceive. The European collective is requesting guidance. Sarah's presence manifested beside her not physically, but as a convergence of thought and intention. Her daughter had become something magnificent in the transformation, a bridge consciousness that could connect disparate groups of survivors across vast distances. They found another cache of preserved pre-burning artifacts. Books, art music encoded in crystallized air. They want to know if we should risk opening it. Clara considered her consciousness reaching out to touch the preservation cache from across the Atlantic. She could feel the memories trapped within Beethoven's symphonies. Shakespeare's plays, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, rendered in molecular detail. But she could also sense something else, a corruption that hadn't been there originally. Destroyer contamination, she diagnosed, recognizing the signature decay pattern. They found it before the builders could fully protect it. If we open it carelessly, we could release a mimetic virus into our collective consciousness. So we lose all of that culture forever, Sarah's distress rippled through multiple dimensions. No, we transform it the way the builders transformed our weapons into gardens. Clara began to sing, not with her voice, but with the quantum vibrations the builders had taught them. The song reached across the ocean, wrapping around the contaminated cache, slowly purifying it through resonance and intention. Other consciousness joined hers, survivors from Asia, Africa, the Americas, even some from the underwater settlements that had emerged in the boiled-away ocean beds. Together they created a harmony that didn't destroy the destroyer contamination, but transformed it, turning its entropy into complexity, its decay into growth. When they finished, the cache bloomed open like a flower made of light and memory. The preserved culture flowed out but changed, evolved. Beethoven's symphonies now included movements that could only be perceived in 5 dimensions. Shakespeare's words carried meanings that transcended language itself. The Sistine Chapel's beauty existed not just visually, but as a tactile experience that could be felt through transformed skin. We're not just preserving the past, Clara realized. We're helping it evolve. A disturbance in the 7th dimension drew Duke's attention. He growled a sound that rippled through reality's warning of approach. Clara focused her perception and saw them new refugees fleeing from another world consumed by the star plague. But these weren't like the builders or the destroyers. These were something else entirely, beings of pure thought that had abandoned physical form entirely in their desperation to escape. Incoming refugees, Clara broadcast to the global consciousness. Non-physical entities. They're scared desperate. They've lost everything. The debate was immediate and intense. Earth's transformed inhabitants had learned to cooperate, but resources were still limited. Every new species they accepted changed the delicate balance they'd achieved. Some argued for closed borders, others for unlimited sanctuary. We were refugees once, Clara reminded them, sharing the memory of the builders' first arrival, their desperate flight from a universe consumed by fire. They could have turned us away when the burning came to Earth. Instead, they tried to save us. The decision came to a vote, not a crude counting of opinions, but a harmonic convergence of consciousness. The result was unanimous. Earth would accept the thought beings, but with conditions. They would contribute to the restoration, share their knowledge, and accept the hybrid nature of Earth's new ecosystem. The integration wasn't easy. The thought beings existed on frequencies that interfered with builder architecture. Their presence caused headaches in humans who hadn't fully adapted to multidimensional perception. Several conflicts arose when they accidentally deleted physical objects by thinking about them incorrectly. But Clara had learned that integration was never easy. She established meditation garden spaces that existed partially in thought and partially in matter, where the different species could learn to coexist. She taught the thought beings how to appreciate physical sensation, while they taught Earth's inhabitants how to think in pure mathematics. One day, while tending to a garden that grew in 11 dimensions simultaneously, Clara was approached by a consciousness she recognized but couldn't quite place. It manifested as a shimmer in the air, a distortion that suggested vast complexity compressed into a small space. "You don't remember me," it said, and suddenly she did. It was Marcus, her ex-husband, but transformed beyond recognition. Where she had become a hybrid of human and builder, he had chosen a different path during preservation, allowing himself to be restructured by one of the crystalline builder variants. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his form shifting through geometries that had no names. "For leaving. For not understanding what you were building in that garden. For not seeing the beauty and patience and growth." "The world ended," Claire replied gently. "Old grievances died with it." "No, they transformed, like everything else." Marcus extended something that wasn't quite a hand but served the same purpose. "I've learned to build now, to tend, to nurture. The builders who preserved me, they showed me what I'd missed, how you saw the world, how you could spend hours watching a single plant grow and find infinity in that moment." Clara accepted the gesture, feeling his transformed consciousness touch hers. In that moment, she saw his journey, the fear during preservation, the confusion of awakening change, the slow realization that survival had required becoming something impossible. She saw his regret, but also his growth. "Help me with something," she said, leading him to a section of the garden that had resisted all attempts at cultivation. The soil there was corrupted at a quantum level, twisted by the burning into something that rejected life. Together they worked. Marcus's crystalline nature could reach into the quantum foam and straighten twisted probability curves. Clara's hybrid consciousness could sing new possibilities into existence. Where they overlapped, where their different transformations synergized, the dead soil began to change. It took days, or perhaps years. Time flowed differently in the garden, but eventually something grew. Not a plant, not exactly. It was a living equation, a biological mathematics that existed as both formula and flower. It proved that even the most corrupted space could be healed through cooperation and patience. The garden attracted others. Chen arrived her consciousness now distributed across a network of preserved human knowledge. She'd become a living library containing everything humanity had known before the burning. She planted memories like seeds growing trees that told stories in their bark flowers, that bloomed as mathematical proofs. Martinez's memorial stood at the garden's heart. They'd found more of his documentation preserved in quantum fluctuations in the stone. His final moments had been transcribed into reality itself, his witness becoming part of the fundamental record of Earth. Clara often sat beside the memorial, sharing the garden's growth with his preserved memory. One evening, though, evening was different when the sun had been replaced by a controlled stellar fragment that existed in multiple dimensions. Clara noticed something strange. The builders who had been largely dormant since the emergence were becoming active again. Their consciousness stirred in the concrete shells, in the preserved structures, in the quantum signatures they'd left throughout the Earth. "Something's coming," the collective builder voice said, stronger than it had been in years. "Not the burning, something else. Something we didn't expect." The warning spread through the global consciousness instantly. Defenses were prepared, shelters reinforced, the hard-won cooperation of Earth's hybrid species strengthened against potential threat. But when it arrived, it wasn't an invasion or another catastrophe. It was a message. It came from beyond the burn zone, from spaces so distant that light itself had forgotten the journey. The message was encoded in gravitational waves and cosmic radiation, in the spaces between quantum states. It took the combined consciousness of every species on Earth to decode it. "Congratulations," it said in concepts that transcended language. "You have passed the first test." The message continued, explaining what Clara had begun to suspect: the burning wasn't random. It was a filter, a test, a deliberate challenge posed by something vast and ancient. Civilizations that survived, that learned to cooperate across species boundaries, that chose preservation over destruction, were invited to join something larger. The garden, the message called it. Not a place, but a state of existence, a network of survived worlds that had passed through their own burnings and emerged transformed. Each world was a node in a vast consciousness that spanned dimensions, universes, realities that Earth's inhabitants were only beginning to perceive. "You are invited to join," the message concluded. To share your preservation, your transformation, your unique solution to survival, to help tend the garden that grows between the burnings. The debate that followed lasted months. Some wanted to accept immediately, eager to join a larger community of survivors. Others feared losing Earth's unique identity, worried about being absorbed into something too vast to comprehend. Clara found herself mediating, as she often did, bridging the gap between hope and fear. We don't have to lose ourselves, she argued. We've already proven that different species can merge while maintaining their essential nature. I'm still the woman who tended tomatoes, even though I can now exist in 11 dimensions. Duke is still my faithful companion, even though he can perceive threats across probability curves. We can join the garden while remaining Earth's children. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. Earth would join the garden, but on its own terms. They would share their knowledge of preservation, their technique of transformation, their discovery that beauty and patience could survive even universal catastrophe. In return, they would learn from other worlds, other solutions, other paths through the burning. The connection, when it was established, was overwhelming. Suddenly, Clara could perceive thousands of worlds, each one scarred by its own burning, each one rebuilt in unique ways. She saw planets where the survivors had become pure energy, others where they'd retreated so far into matter that they existed in the spaces between quarks. She saw worlds that had turned their entire planets into vast organisms, others that had scattered into trillion individual consciousnesses spread across cosmic dust. But in each one she recognized something familiar, the drive to preserve, to grow, to tend. Every survived world was a garden in its own way, carefully cultivated by consciousness that had learned the hard lesson of cooperation. We're not alone, Sarah said, her consciousness bright with wonder. We never were. No, Clara agreed. We were just in our own greenhouse thinking it was the whole world. The transformation of Earth accelerated with access to the garden's knowledge. Technologies that would have taken millennia to develop were shared freely. Techniques for healing the burning scars, for preventing future catastrophes, for nurturing life in impossible circumstances, flowed between worlds like pollen between flowers. Clara's role evolved too. She became Earth's first garden tender, responsible for maintaining the connection between Earth and the larger network. It was like being a gardener on a cosmic scale, ensuring that Earth contributed its unique beauty while also receiving what it needed to flourish. She established exchange programs, consciousness from other worlds visiting Earth to learn their preservation techniques, while Earth's inhabitants explored other nodes of the garden. Each exchange brought new perspectives, new solutions, new possibilities for growth. Duke accompanied her on these journeys through the garden network. His animal consciousness transformed and expanded, could perceive connections that even the builders missed. He would often lead Clara to dying nodes, worlds that were failing despite surviving their burning, where Earth's unique approach to transformation could offer salvation. On one such journey, they found a world where the survivors had preserved themselves too perfectly. They'd emerged from their burning unchanged, and in their rigidity, they were dying. Clara taught them the lesson of her garden, that growth required change, that preservation wasn't about keeping things static, but about maintaining the potential for transformation. She showed them how Earth's inhabitants had emerged as hybrids, fundamentally changed, but still essentially themselves. She demonstrated how the builders and humans had merged, not through domination, but through symbiosis. Slowly, carefully, she helped them transform their perfect preservation into living growth. Years passed, decades, centuries, though time meant less and less as Clara's consciousness expanded through the garden. Earth healed completely its scars, becoming beauty marks, its transformed surface supporting life forms that earlier humans would have considered impossible. Cities grew like forests, technology and biology indistinguishable. The distinctions between species blurred as consciousness learned to flow between forms like water between vessels. Clara aged, though age was different for transformed beings. She didn't decay, but evolved her consciousness, becoming more complex, more interconnected with the garden network. She could feel herself becoming part of something larger while still maintaining her core identity. The woman who had loved her garden, who had chosen understanding over fear, who had helped bridge the gap between species. On what would have been her 150th birthday by old Earth reckoning, she stood again in the space that had been her garden. It was unrecognizable now, a nexus point where thousands of dimensions intersected, where consciousness from across the garden could meet and mingle. But somehow, she could still feel the ghost of her tomato plants, the memory of soil between her fingers, the peace of those evening hours before the first mound appeared. Duke was there, of course, his form now more concept than creature, but still unmistakably her faithful companion. Sarah had become something like a goddess of communication, her consciousness facilitating connections across the entire garden. Even Marcus maintained a presence, his crystalline nature having evolved into something that could restructure reality itself at the quantum level. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked, manifesting beside her mother. "The simplicity of before." Clara considered the question, her consciousness touching the memories preserved in the quantum foam. She could still access the feeling of simple soil, simple growth, simple satisfaction in nurturing life. But she could also feel the vast complexity she'd become, the infinite possibilities she could now perceive and nurture. "I miss the innocence," she admitted, "the belief that my small garden was separate from the cosmos. But I wouldn't go back. We were sleeping before dreaming of gardens, while the universe prepared to test us. Now we're awake, and we're helping others wake too." A disturbance in the garden network drew her attention. Another world was beginning its burning, another civilization facing the test. Without hesitation, Clara reached out through the network, offering Earth's knowledge, Earth's experience, Earth's hope. "Build shelters," she advised them. "Trust in cooperation. Preserve what matters, but be willing to transform. And remember, the burning ends. What matters is what grows after." She felt their terror, their desperation, but also the first seeds of hope. Some of them would survive. They would emerge transformed, scarred, but stronger, and they would join the garden. The cycle would continue. Claire returned her attention to her own garden, this impossible space that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She had work to do. New refugees were arriving, fleeing from burnings in distant corners of reality. Earth's transformation techniques were being requested by dozens of struggling worlds. The garden itself was evolving, becoming something even its eldest members hadn't anticipated. And through it all, the lesson of her original garden remained patient, tending, careful, nurturing the faith that from small seeds, infinite possibility could grow. The burning had ended. The building had begun. And in gardens across dimensions, consciousness in forms that defied old categories tended life with the dedication of those who had learned the ultimate truth that creation was always stronger than destruction, that cooperation could overcome any catastrophe, and that even the end of the world was just another beginning. Clara smiled, an expression that rippled through dimensions, warming spaces that had never known heat. She reached into probability itself and pulled out a seed, not a physical seed, but the idea of one, the potential for growth encoded in the fabric of space-time. She planted it in the quantum foam, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the intersection of what was and what might be. And as she had done so many times before in so many forms, across so many realities, she began to tend it. The garden grew.